February the 1st, 2003. Session 2 with Howard Campbell.
Hi.
So, what else can you tell me about April 6th? We still haven't gotten to the bottom of this pool hall thing yet.
I have grave concerns about continuing this conversation.
Grave concerns? Aren't you being hyperbolic?
No. I'm telling you the internal thoughts of somebody who went insane. It would be healthier for you to stop right now. These ideas are communicable.
So you mean these ideas are contagious?
Yes. By sharing these ideas with you, I am implanting live meme viruses in your head. By continuing this conversation, I'm putting you at risk of destabilizing your perceptive reality, and I don't know if you can handle it.
I don't seem to have caught any insanity viruses yet. I'm willing to risk it. Besides, you've been exposed to these ideas. You seem relatively well adjusted. I can handle whatever you tell me.
Okay. I may be painfully self-aware and sensitive. You are cardboard and too detached to feel me. I suspect if you really tried on Bucky's, your defensive walls may come tumbling down. Americans like their righteousness and contorted definition of freedom. Here, try this on for size. America's democracy ended with the assassination of John F. Kennedy. His murder was a coup d'etat. Lyndon Johnson, aided by the Central Intelligence Agency, stacked the deck for the game of politics we're playing ever since.
You sound like some of the paranoids who came through here. I don't suffer fools lightly. I'm interested in what happened to Richard Bucky Wilson, not your theories about politics. Tell me more about what happened on April 6th, 1993, please.
Bucky had been researching the assassination just prior to April 6th. He was a student of the events surrounding JFK's assassination, or, as he would call it, the Johnson coup. You can go to Bennington College's library and find what he checked out over this period. It should be easy enough to find out, and his books became overdue because of his hospital stay. I bring this up because these ideas could have been a catalyst, a sudden realization that the world was not as he knew it, a realization that affected the way he saw reality. Now, in his journal on April 6th, Bucky stated that everything occurred to him as superficial.
Did he give specifics?
His journal simply stated everything is superficial. I assume he was reading Man's Search for Meaning, because he also wrote, compared to a psychiatrist held captive in a Nazi concentration camp, nothing in my life is significant. Then, on the morning of April 6th, he had come up to me ranting, everything is fake, manufactured, synthetic, and dirty. He ran off as quickly as he had approached.
You know he was losing it.
No. I just thought he was being dramatic. None of us really knew the extent of his thoughts and how debilitating they were until he was hospitalized. While he was hospitalized, we were in the dark. I didn't start reading his journal until I got here and found it in his hotel room.
Why do you think he left his journal for you now?
Now you're asking me to speculate. I don't think Bucky could give you a rational answer. He explains in his journal that the events of April 6th are obscured. His notes don't seem to be from that day, like he revisited his notes from that day and made comments on top of them. One of these comments reads, sometime this afternoon is the last point I was connected with time. Speculatively, this is about the time he headed to the campus pool room. Allow me to read to you from his journal here. Halfway there, I stopped walking and looked at a tree. I felt a breeze and anticipated the tree's movement. When I was surprised by the tree's movement, somehow it was noted, not in words, but a thought, nonetheless. After a bit, I stopped noticing any discrepancy. I stood there and observed the tree. I felt what the tree felt. The spring air had a bite to it. The sun offered a warm reprieve from the Arctic gusts. I empathized with the tree for budding and felt its resistance to release its flowers. Any way I try to put this experience into words is only a metaphor. At the time, I had no words in my head. I know I was content to stand there, looking at the tree. Now, Bucky was speaking about human-plant entrainment. He'd always been fascinated by entrainment.
What is entrainment?
Well, centuries ago, Christian Huygens noticed how separate entities will fall into rhythm with one another. Specifically, two pendulum clocks placed in close proximity that began to keep the same time. In 1665, he coined the word entrainment to describe this phenomenon. Now, Huygens noticed that the clock in the study ran about a minute slower each day from the clock in his living room. Then he moved the two clocks side by side, and when they were side by side, the discrepancy disappeared. They kept the same time. When he separated the two clocks, the discrepancy reappeared. Christian Huygens saw that the clocks had formed a compromise. The clocks together ran at the same time, but they ran 30 seconds slower than his pocket watch. Now, these observations led to his discovery, or labeling, of entrainment, the tendency of cyclical objects to meld into a common rhythm. Bucky would give examples of entrainment, such as women in college dorms whose menstrual cycles become one, and electric generators across the field that develop a common rhythm. Now, as I said, he collected stories and facts, and he didn't discriminate between the two and put them in his notes. I'm telling you about his entries in the approximate order he left them for me to find.
Yeah, I derailed you from Bucky's experience with the tree.
Well, Bucky entrained with the tree. He slowed down his rhythm and softened his assertiveness to feel the rhythm of the tree. Jihan, the scruffiest student on campus, came by and stood with him for a bit before asking what he was doing, and Bucky told him he was standing with the tree. Jihan then asked him if he was okay, and he said yes, and together they stood with the tree. After a while, Jihan said okay and wandered away. Then Bucky made his way to the pool room. He hadn't realized he'd spent over 3 hours with the tree. This was the beginning of a tweaked perception that would last for 4 days. When he got to the pool hall, people there appeared to him as automatons. They didn't seem human. He couldn't feel them. They told him that his friends had been there and played pool for a couple hours and had left. And then Bucky headed to Darren Barshdorf's room. Then Bucky wrote that when he left the pool room, Bennington's campus seemed empty. He wrote that he did not see a single person on his way to Darren's room. Now, this was odd. The campus was silent, and when he got to Darren's room, there was a sign on the door written in crayon that said, "Welcome." Now, Bucky's state displayed nicely into his idea that he was being admitted into the Brotherhood of Sufi warriors. He took the sign as an invitation to enter without knocking. He found an empty room with an uncharacteristically made bed, and on Darren's bed was a hexagonal white board with a black border. It occurred to Bucky first as a puzzle, and then as a test, a component of an elaborate ritual which he saw himself having to pass before being initiated. There were 23 pieces on the 6-sided board. Now, he had spent too much time in numerology and too much time reading the Illuminatus trilogy to let 23 pieces on a 6-sided board go unnoticed. So he meditated on the pieces, which looked like Escher building blocks. You know, the puzzle pieces fit together to build 3D objects on a 2D board that could never be built. Because these Escher pieces visually bent rules of any known physical plane. He constructed the rules of his vision quest as he went along. Now, at the time, this invention of rules occurred to him as akin to discovering the laws of physics. He saw Sufis as real magicians practicing magic. Magic was the science of being effective. That's when Bucky cited Aleister Crowley, "That which we do not understand, we attribute to magic."
Crowley? A Satanist?
I'll come back to that, but yes, Crowley was a self-proclaimed Satanist. He intentionally wanted to address that which the church forbade. He attacked the church built in Jesus' name. Now, in the dorm room, Bucky examined the board, trying to understand his mission. He noticed a design on the back that could be created with the magnetic pieces on the front, but this felt too easy. But for all he knew, the challenges leading to initiation may start easy. This could make sense as a means to ensure that a new player recognizes that there's a game to be played. The design was a box inverted on itself. So he started trying to arrange the pieces on the front to mirror the image on the back, and he quickly found this to be impossible with the pieces at hand. He was foiled. He thought about drawing the required image on the face of the board, but that didn't feel right. But the solution would make itself known to him. He relaxed. He started playing with the pieces he had and found that he could create the inverse image minus one piece. This was the answer. He expected the Sufis to easily see things 2 different ways, and his solution was in line with his expectations that a Sufi puzzle would test his ability to loosen his associations and reassociate objects. But he went further. He saw the puzzle and himself as part of the solution. You see, There were 5 of the 6 pieces required to make the inverse object. Once assembled, he saw first the 6-sided board with second, the picture on the back that Bucky deduced to be 6 pieces, and third, the picture on the front consisted of 5 pieces plus 1 inferred object for 6 pieces. 3. Elements of 6. 6, 6, 6. His initiation had begun.
So was this board part of an elaborate hoax somebody was playing on Bucky?
Well, nobody had orchestrated Bucky finding these objects. In hindsight, it appears as a series of bizarre coincidences. Bizarre in their overlap with what Bucky was focusing on.
Okay, so tell me this. Did Bucky occur to you as being delusional?
No. Delusional people aren't grounded in reality. Delusional people seem to overlook obvious schisms between their ideas and reality. Bucky was incredulous about what was happening. He tested his realities, but the schema he was testing his experiences against may have been delusional.
The schema of a schizophrenic is delusional.
Our Bucky was labeled as bipolar, so please, curb your judgment. I was with Bucky about 5 years earlier when he discovered Magic by Aleister Crowley at a bookstore. He'd gone there to buy something else, and the title Magic caught his eye, so he bought it. Now, the book suggested that he lived a perfunctory life, not taking responsibility for his actions. While the book was old and not written in our modern self-help vein, he interpreted it as a guide to a possible way of life. Magic begins with the premise that to know anything, you must approach life in a scientific manner. Crowley borrowed Plato's premise that to know others, you must first get to know yourself. So he took this as an instruction that he must know his self. Crowley suggests that without self-knowledge, we're just following a pattern we constructed earlier in life that fit our earlier needs. Crowley suggested that by knowing yourself, you would discover your true will. He proposes one all-binding, unifying code of conduct. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law.
Do what you want shall be the whole of the law sounds antisocial, sociopathic, to use your loose term.
Well, the line doesn't say want, it says wilt. Your true will. Crowley would argue that an antisocial hasn't quieted himself down enough to be in touch with himself.
How do you know you aren't antisocial?
The same way you know you aren't Jesus Christ. You just know. I'll go one step further. Anybody who thinks they are Jesus Christ should check themselves into a hospital like this. Crowley told Bucky via his book that Bucky hadn't learned anything for himself because he hadn't recognized which values he'd accepted from his parents and culture as opposed to deciding for his self. Crowley accused him of being a robot, programmed by his society. He was out to prove this to him, and Crowley mocked him for entertaining the notion that he was agnostic. Crowley chastised him for trying to compartmentalize an all-powerful unifying power under the label of God. He challenged Bucky, stating that he mistook labels for actual energy. He accused him of being a Christian without knowing it. Once Crowley hooked Bucky with his logic, Crowley told Bucky that he was the beast, 666 Satan. He said that if Bucky weren't a Christian, these labels wouldn't have an impact on him. And he promised that if Bucky could let go of his prejudices towards these labels, he could teach him to be happier through increased effectiveness. So Bucky studied Crowley's teachings.
Okay, can you keep going?
Sure. Another thing that bugged Bucky was the way that the church has a tendency to report ideas as facts. For Bucky, Christmas is an occasion to give and receive gifts. For others, December 25th is the day to honor the birth of Jesus. During the first 2 centuries after Jesus' death, Christmas was not celebrated. But biblical scholars came up with multiple dates: January 1st, January 6th, March 25th, and May 20th. Now, the May date makes the most sense for Christmas. Luke 2, verse 8 reports that the shepherds were watching their sheep by night when they heard about Jesus' birth. Now, shepherds guarded their flocks day and night only during lambing time, which was in the spring. However, in 349 AD, Pope Julius formally selected December 25th as Christmas, a date no biblical scholar was suggesting. You see, this date was already widely celebrated by Romans in honor of the sun god Mithras. It was easier to reframe a celebration, usurping its meaning, than to create a new celebration and get villagers to abandon another.
Yeah, but I'm more interested in what happened at Bennington before Bucky went to the hospital.
Bucky wrote about the Pope's selection of Christmas Day in his journal when he was at Bennington just before he went to the hospital. He thought these were important details. He praised the church for helping villagers not throw away their money on charlatans who presented themselves as having supernatural powers. That part was good. The burning people at the stake part rather sucked. But Bucky put this shit in his journal. This is the essence of what he was thinking about then. Those in charge of labeling labeled the unexplained negatively as supernatural in the interest of preserving their larger power structures, what Bucky called super memeplexes.
Yeah, okay, go on.
Okay. Back to the puzzle in Darren's room. Bucky placed the solved puzzle back where he'd found it. He emptied the ashtray and left. Now, outside, people appeared peculiar to him. His manifesto depicts him asking himself if everyone at Bennington was on it. Was he the only non-initiated here? He didn't think so. But the idea haunted him. Bucky thought of Bennington College as a modern-day Witch Mountain monastery where all the little kids reveled.
Witch Mountain?
Yeah, like in the Disney movie Escape to Witch Mountain, where all the kids with special powers go for training.
You know, my kids love Harry Potter. Maybe it's like Hogwarts.
Yes, like Hogwarts, but instead where the kids naturally knew they had tangible powers, kids at Bennington were assimilated into the way of Sufism through the ordeal of a testing mechanism. Bucky speculated in his journal that if one wasn't assimilated, they might be discredited, banished, or abandoned. Bucky didn't know, and this scared him. Now, outside of Darren's room, Bucky stood still, watching as people passed in small groups or alone. And Jihan emerged and smiled at him, and he said, "You going to dinner?" Bucky nodded, and they joined the direction of the general flow, and they walked in silence. Now, once upstairs, they said their student ID numbers and were admitted to an all-you-can-eat buffet that catered to Bennington students, children of some of the wealthiest families in the world. So Bucky followed Jihan into the smoking room, and they joined friends at a back table against the wall. I was among them, but these details are more from his journal than my recollection. I wouldn't have remembered the details of the conversation. From my perspective, nothing special was going on. But Bucky wrote in his journal about how Bill Scully was ranting about an article he'd come across. Bill smoked natural spirits to avoid chemicals, but Bill looks more like a Marlboro man than a granola boy. He was this tough kid raised in El Centro and rather notorious for wearing steel-tipped boots, even with shorts.
Let's stay on task. What was the article about?
Yes, sir. Apparently the Pope had decreed some new sins for the first time in some 80 years. Primarily, Scully was going off on how it was now a sin to evade taxes. Scully was preaching how this was irrefutable proof that the church was sucking up to local governments, aka nations, since its fall from prominence with what started as the Church of England but spread like a virus to the New World as Protestantism. Now, Bucky heard what Bill was saying, but he was enchanted and distracted by what he saw in the room. He wasn't looking at the people, although they were interesting enough. I mean, there was Ginger Parker, and the glamour set had decided it was formal night, so she and her friends were dressed in formal cocktail attire. 3 guys were in black tie, and the women wore cocktail dresses with breast-popping necklines and feather bows. Very roaring 20s, but in modern garb. If stereotyped from a distance, our table looked pretty goth. I mean, Scully's best friend Jim was in town, and Jim always brought abundant alcohol, which warranted some to suit his fancy by adorning themselves in black outfits with spiked jewelry and heavy mascara. Now, instead of looking at the people, Bucky was staring at the colors around most everybody, primarily blue and green. And then he saw somebody shift from blue into green, through yellow, and intensify into orange, at which point the person lit a cigarette and settled back down to green. His eyes settled on another person who repeated this cycle. As he scanned the room, virtually everybody was aglow. Some shifted in color, while others remained relatively stable. Now, from this account, you might think Bucky was tripping on acid, but he wasn't. Bill was yapping away. He shifted from yellow into orange and back to yellow, but never calmed down to green or blue. He was incited.
Could you tell he was taking a break from reality? How did Bucky occur to you?
Well, when somebody takes a break from something, I think of them as resting. Bucky wasn't resting in any sense of the word. He didn't sleep for 4 days, and he was always quietly engaged in something, is all I can recollect. I don't rightly know I wasn't focusing on him. But when Bucky told me about his experiences after getting out of the hospital, I was shocked. I remembered Bill's rant, but I hadn't remembered anything unusual about Bucky. It's kind of scary to have somebody having such a peculiar experience and not be able to sense anything out of the ordinary was going on.
Did Bucky explain how he kept it a secret in his journal?
Well, he said that he thought he was being tested, that his task back then was to see if he could get Bobby to finally shut up.
Bobby?
Oh, well, Bucky wrote that ever since he could remember, Bobby had been talking. Bobby is the voice in his head, not the problem-solving one, but the chatterbox. They both have the same voice, just one is intentional and one feels passive. So Bucky named this passive voice Bobby at some point during the 4 days before he entered the hospital. He didn't specify the situation in his journal where he named Bobby, but he does write here. I remember being 12 years old and very aware of Bobby. Of course, I hadn't begun personifying my voice, so I just thought of that voice in my head as me. Imposing my current perspective on a younger me, I wanted to know if Bobby was always talking, or if sometimes he was silent and I just didn't notice the silence. To test this, I used one of those newfangled digital watches, and I would randomly set the alarm so that I didn't know when it would go off. I found that every time the alarm went off, Bobby was talking. The only exception was when the alarm awoke me. After a while, I concluded that when I was awake, Bobby was talking. I view this as symptomatic of a nervous mind. Then it occurred to me as normal.
The stuff before what you just read, that was all in his journal?
Yeah. Well, all except for the characterizations like goth and very roaring 20s.
Please, stick to what you know Bucky was commenting on. At least let me know what you are commenting as opposed to reporting Bucky's observations from his journal.
Yeah, okay. But this next part is from his journal, but not about Bennington.
Okay, go on.
In 1991, Bucky began his first mind experiments. He knew his mind was capable of far more than he was using it for. His initial interest was to do complicated mathematics in his head. He figured that if he could visualize numbers, he could do complex algebraic equations in his head. He never accomplished this, at least not through these means. But he does go on to describe that it wasn't until 1992 that he actively worked at silencing Bobby. This was not a violent move, but an active interest in what his mind could do if it didn't need to exert the energy to follow Bobby's train of thought. Bucky wrote, "Never whistle while you piss," and credited this to Robert Anton Wilson, the author of the Illuminatus trilogy. Wilson said that the two biggest fallacies of the 20th century were that politicians weren't that smart and that they mean well. Anyway, Bucky saw Bobby as a deterrent to seeing clearly and hearing with acuity. He found that as he got a better look at a sculpture, he saw it more clearly as Bobby slowed down. He particularly found that he heard people better. He didn't have this already running commentary on their conversation. This commentary interpreted their comments through his veil of prejudices, anything he decided before this conversation. These prejudiced and prejudged notions manifested in the form of the voice, Bobby, and was triggered by their comments. Now, Bucky's main objective with his early experiments was to mess with his visual field. He wanted to hold images of numbers in his sight and play with them the way a child rearranges building blocks. He started by trying to visualize geometric shapes imposed on what he was naturally seeing. He talked to people who say they can do this. He had conversations where friends claimed to be able to visualize others in different clothes. Bucky didn't doubt that they could do as they claimed. He just never attained the skill. He said that his greatest results came from being extraordinarily accurate with his word. He said that when he intentionally became verbally accurate and adamant about keeping his word, his life became fuller. He noted that when he became an extremist about keeping his word, he was much more guarded against promising anything and much more likely to generate that which he spoke. But this was a later experiment. At this point in time, he was working on mental experimentation with his visual field. Visually, Bucky was able to create waves and patterns. In 1992, he spent about 1.5 hours waiting for Mildred to get home, and with few interruptions, he watched wave after wave roll across her front lawn. In order to do this, he had to be still, and Bobby needed to be quiet. On that day, Bobby obliged him. Following this anecdote, Bucky wrote, "When he lost all his money gambling, he started making mental bets. That's how he lost his mind. Author unknown." Obviously, I don't know where he got this from. His journal continues.
Is his journal and the manifesto, the longer line, the same document?
Yes. His journal continues with Bucky sitting in the Bennington cafeteria and flowing with the scenery. Bobby was nowhere to be heard. Jihan turned to him and asked him what he was spacing on, and Bucky explained the colors to him. Jihan told him that he sometimes saw colors around people too. So Bucky knew he was among magicians, producers of magic. Jihan was helping Bucky feel comfortable with his new powers, his psi.
Psi, as in an exhale?
No, psi. P-S-I, the 23rd letter of the Greek alphabet, a word commonly used by some psychologists to represent phenomena outside their understanding, otherwise known as ESP. Now, when Bucky left the cafeteria and made his way back to his dorm, he wanted a nap. He was used to taking naps. And when he settled into bed, Bobby appeared and questioned Bucky's self-perceived magic. Bobby questioned the discrepancy between what he'd known as real and what he'd been experiencing. And then Bucky wrote about a dream. He was flying over hills and mountains. He dreamt of a transparent plane powered by tourists who were pedaling to keep their plane aloft. As he flew beneath them, their tour guide announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, Benjamin Garth." Benjamin Garth had been Bucky's stage name as a performer of magic. Now, the dream continued, and he glided over a hill and saw Bennington College. In the middle of the central lawn, he saw about 30 women, all wearing skirts. As he flew overhead, the women waved and lifted their skirts. No panties. Bucky glided back around and headed for Ginger Parker, a beautiful young woman with the charisma of a queen. She was one of the girls that had been all dressed up at the cafeteria earlier. So Ginger leaned back and spread her legs open, and he started to go down on her. She was enjoying it, and Bucky was enjoying it. And the other women disappeared. Bucky and Ginger were suddenly in a room without edges, enveloped by an endless, soft, flowing comforter. Bucky wrote that it felt gloriously good. Then, Bucky heard Bill Scully's voice through his dream. Scully said, "Bucky, if you need me, I am here." Bucky looked up and out into the whiteness and told him to go away. He looked down, and Ginger Parker was gone. Bummer. Scully's voice resumed, "You need me, I am coming." And Bucky woke up saying, "Fuck you, I don't need you." But the image was gone, and Bobby was awake. Bobby asked, "What do you make of that?" Bucky wrote that he wasn't accustomed to Bobby asking questions. But Bobby had tended to be more of a commentator than an inquisitor. But Bobby went silent. Bucky got out his die and started talking while rolling the die until he landed on the notion that Bill Scully was coming over. He was journaling while all this was happening. His notes are very exacting. He also wrote, "Am I being ridiculous, worthy of ridicule?" He notes that Bobby chided him. With Bill's friend Jim in town, Bill was hosting a party. There was no way Bill would come. Bucky smoked a cigarette while Bobby chastised him for entertaining the expectation of Bill's arrival. There was silence. Bobby and he weren't talking. So Bucky sat on the edge of his bed, feeling dumb, but nonetheless expecting Bill to show up. Then the front door of his dorm house opened, and Bucky heard the unmistakable clank of steel-tipped boots on the stairs. Bill was there. Twisp.
What does twisp mean?
Oh, well, twisp is just an expression like, "Oh, shit." Before I continue with what happened after Bucky's nap, I have to fill you in on the previous spring. The night before graduation, Bucky, Bill Scully, their friend Dave Williamson, and another 120 students all dosed on liquid A.
Liquid A?
Liquid acid.
Ah. Yeah, 120 students all hallucinating en masse. No good can come from that.
No, I won't argue. On this night of a campus of about 400 2D, 180 students stayed for graduation, and 2/3 of these students were tripping their asses off. During that night, Bucky found Stephen Folks playing with fire. Stefan is an artist, and he was playing with words as he sparked the fire, stroking the flame to create a blizzard of red and orange flying sparks. He talked about feeling magical and empowered. He kept repeating, "Flutter by, butterfly." as Bucky and a circle of onlookers watched the sparks, flying bugs of glowing amber, flutter by, butterfly. Stefan talked about how if he did become famous and published, then after his death people would know him through select words. He didn't know which of his words would represent his spirit. Flutter by, butterfly. He just hoped that enough of them would be captured to communicate his spirit. Butterfly, flutter by. It was then that Bucky first had the vision of the world as primarily controlled by the powerful few, the meme generals, that the power to garner consensus was more powerful than money. Granted, in many ways money can buy consensus. However, money is not powerful when people won't accept your currency. Bucky even noted, if people won't accept your currency, is it still money? A meme general is one who controls vast influence. His or her army shapes the messages consumed by the masses, enchanting the listeners to understand their message. For countries, this is called propaganda. For churches, this is now called a sermon. For companies, it's called marketing or communications. Bucky figured that the Dalai Lama must be a meme general. The president was questionable. I mean, he viewed him more as a puppet. But Bucky reasoned that some chairmen of insurance companies were part of this set. He didn't know. He tried to derive rules of engagement from which he sought to appeal an entry. Whether or not Einstein had been a member, he wasn't sure. He's going to suspect that Buckminster Fuller definitely was not a member, but that Fuller knew of the club and had attempted to let the rest of us know. Perhaps this last notion was the seed idea that led to Bucky's newfound worldview and eventual hospital incarceration.
How so?
Well, a seed idea is an aggressive meme, a meme that seeks to take possession of a mind.
Why do you think this seed idea, the notion that Fuller attempted to tell the general public about this set of meme generals, was a catalyst to psychosis for Richard Wilson?
Hofstadter's Gödel Escherbach toys with phrases like, I am not the subject of this sentence. Bucky described Gödel Escherbach as the most self-referential book he'd ever read. The book presented the idea of self-unfolding codes that featured a flag to their existence and included the decoding structure within its very nature. Now, Bucky projected the structure on Fuller's work, searching for an encoded meaning. Why do I think this was a seed idea? Because it seems to be the central theme that led to his first hospitalization. If an idea is self-unfolding, it requires little external validity because the idea is meant to be hidden to begin with. Bucky had been reading about how a scientist in the 50s had sketched out a doomsday device, utilizing huge speakers in the desert, enabling the controller to throw the Earth off its axis. Einstein went out of his way to discredit the scientist. Later in life, Einstein said that the theory was viable, but that he discredited the young man because of his lack of discretion. Bucky figured other meme generals would discredit those who did not hold a great enough respect for discretion. In fact, he took this notion a step further. He figured that the meme generals would contrive a system to discredit those who might divulge their existence. He figured mental hospitals would be useful to this end.
Memes are the same as thoughts?
Well, thoughts would limit memes to conscious ideas. A meme is anything a mind replicates, from a song to the notion that Ford puts quality first. But it could also be a gesture or even seen in shifting proclivities. Memetics is the study of memes as living organisms, primarily by applying the laws of genetics to ideas. In genetics, it is recognized that isolation breeds mutation. In cultures, it was evident that separate societies developed separate languages. Now, add entrainment. Memes placed near each other have a tendency to meld. The Southern accent is an amalgamation between a British rhythm of speaking and an African rhythm. Funny. Despite the bigotry of many Caucasian Southerners and their pride in distinguishing themselves from African Americans, a defining quality of a Southerner, their accent, was adopted from extended close proximity to Africans. Anyway, back to April 6, 1993. After Bucky woke up from his dream about flying and Ginger Parker, Bill Scully came in and asked Bucky if he was sleeping. Bucky said yes, but that he was awake now, and asked him to turn on a light. Bill offered him a smoke, and they lit up. Then Bill asked Bucky if he was doing okay. He said yes, and he told him about the dream. Bill said that he hadn't seen him at the party, so he figured he would come by and see if Bucky was okay. Then Bucky told Bill that if he had waited 15 minutes, the dream would have had him fucking Ginger Parker. Bucky told Bill he was fine. He just had a long day, and that if he didn't fall back to sleep, he'd come over. So Bill left. Then Bobby chided Bucky for not telling Bill that he'd expected him to come over. Bucky got irritably bored with Bobby, saying that if he was so confident in his intuition that he'd have told Bill exactly what he'd been thinking. Then he fell back asleep. The previous summer, Bucky spent 2 months in Richmond, Virginia, with Bill Scully and Dave Williamson. Dave grew up in Richmond. That trip to Richmond tweaked Bucky's perception and probably contributed to Bucky's hospitalization. Then Bucky began noticing Fnords. He saw that many establishments near an area called The Bend had the word truth with a capital T someplace, somewhere. Bucky didn't know what this meant or where it came from. Dave didn't know what he was talking about.
We call this pattern recognition, seeing patterns in chaos. This leads to the creation of conspiracy theories.
There are patterns in mathematical chaos. Since they are ephemeral, only existing within ranges of space, time, or other conditions, scientists were blind to them up until recently. Truth with a capital T exists among other public symbolism. It is a conspiracy, and if you're black and live in Richmond, it is dangerous to test this theory. The force is well known by local non-whites. Bucky's journal explains how he explored the city's museums and took a self-guided tour of Monument Boulevard, which is this beautiful tree-lined street with statues commemorating what, in the South, they call the war between the states, which he'd been taught to call the Civil War. Each statue was embedded with hidden codes. If the warrior was looking north, they fought for the north, and vice versa. They were all on horseback, and if the horse had his front hoof up, he'd been wounded in battle. If it was rearing, the rider had died in battle. At the very end of the boulevard was a monument to the whole war. Now, this was a huge monument, the size of a small house. And on its base, these words appear. We have lost a battle, but the war continues. Eventually, truth will prevail. Bucky saw, eventually, truth will prevail. That's where it came from. This is the tagline for the KKK. Truth, with a capital T, was a racist slur warning blacks to stay out.
You can still see this in Richmond?
To the best of my knowledge. But Bucky started looking for secret symbols. His journal shows an increasing suspicion with the word welcome.
Why welcome?
Because the word welcome is usually posted or painted outside of churches and retail shops, places where professionals attempt to alter your perceptions for their profits. He looked for the number 23 and in Masonic symbols. He looked for repeating patterns to see if there was meaning behind those images he found frequent or peculiar.
So did he find anything?
Well, he found Cosmography, a new book by Buckminster Fuller. Fuller died in 1983, and this was 1992. It turned out that Fuller finished Cosmography in 83 on the day he left for the hospital to attend to his dying wife. Fuller was on the cover of Time magazine in 1980 as one of the century's greatest thinkers, then died 3 years later, and they couldn't get his last book published. The preface to the book explains that when the manuscript had been discovered after Fuller's death, it was found on an uncharacteristically neat desk with a note on top that seemed to intuit both his death and this problem. If something happens to me and I die suddenly, I want you to know of the extraordinary importance of my now being written book Cosmography.
Fuller sounds like he was paranoid. If something happens to me and I die suddenly.
He was 88 years old. Thinking he may die someday is fairly reasonable for an octogenarian. But Fuller was a bit self-aggrandizing, and he was a modern-day Cassandra, blessed with foresight and cursed with incredibility. He talked about wealth as a system's ability to sustain itself into the future. Now, this works for a person, a species, or any living organism. Look at the way capitalism is set up. Fuller cautioned that year after year, less and less money is available to the average person. The rich are getting richer. At a certain point, this system will fall apart. You don't hear politicians discussing this. Politics is the Potemkin village of corporations. It is a mathematical certainty that if our economy continues this trajectory, it will implode. Fuller talked about the need to find a statically indeterminate societal system outside of lords and peasants. He talked about this being the promise of America. He also talks about us living under a false assumption of scarcity. This perception is propagated by those currently supported at the Lord level by the toils of the masses. The resources of this spaceship are being disproportionately distributed under the veil that there isn't enough to go around, so we each need to grab what we can. Now, cosmography begins. The Dark Ages still reign over all humanity, and the depth and persistence of this domination are only now becoming clear. This Dark Ages prison has no steel bars, chains, or locks. Instead, it is locked by disorientation and built from misinformation. Caught up in a plethora of conditioned reflexes and driven by the human ego, both warden and prisoner attempt meagerly to compete with God. All are intractably skeptical of what they do not understand. We are powerfully imprisoned in these dark ages simply by the terms in which we have been conditioned to think. Bucky read Cosmography. Realized that just before he left Bennington for that summer in Richmond, he'd had the acid trip where he saw the warriors of magic ruling the planet. He thought there was value in being recognized by these powers. He was really tripped up when he found himself named in Cosmography. Fuller literally pointed to Bucky. In 1979, a newspaperman in Los Angeles, Richard Brenneman, arranged for me to meet with a group of very young people to discuss the subjects I've dealt with in this book. After 6 months of reading my books, each had prepared a set of questions about my thoughts and statements. They had lively interest in what I had to say. I asked them their ages. The oldest, a boy, was 12. He said he was interested in the tricks of magicians. That was Bucky. Bucky interviewed Fuller and was the 12-year-old interested in the tricks of magicians.
This is real?
You can buy the book and find the reference. Yeah. Yes, it's real. Anyway, Bucky reread Cosmography. Did you know that Buckminster Fuller died 2 days after entering the hospital?
No, I didn't.
Yes, his wife took him there. While there, she faded into a coma. Both died within 1 day of each other. Neither consciously knew the other died. They were Duprass, paired souls that melded together, performing a celestial dance where neither object is orbiting around the other. Duprass was one of the cosmological vocabulary words Bucky adopted from Vonnegut's Cat's Cradle. You characterized Bucky's grave premonition as paranoid. Now, just because somebody is labeled paranoid doesn't mean the patterns they recognize aren't real.
So, what else do you know happened before Bucky went to the hospital at Bennington?
Well, he wrote about a second dream. Sometime after Bucky fell asleep, he had another dream. He may have had more, but this is the one he woke up to. Bucky dreamt that he was in the country outside of Richmond, Virginia. He was spying on self-help guru Anthony Robbins, who was dressed in black with a long leather coat, and he was standing next to a large fire and surrounded by naked women who were circling him while chanting, "Whether you know you can or whether you believe you can't, you're right." Then Anthony Robbins spotted him. Robbins pointed to him, and the naked women ran through the forest to surround Bucky, and they started chanting in tongues while some circled him. 2 of the women pulled Bucky prone by his hands and his feet. He couldn't move. Knowing Dave Williamson lived close by, he started calling for him. Now, Bucky explained to me that he woke up and he couldn't move. He opened his eyes okay, but it took him some time to regain mobility in the rest of his body. He was sweaty and rather freaked. He was staring thoughtlessly when Bobby woke up and said, "So you really expect Dave Williamson to show up?" Bucky just lay there. Bobby and he were silent, but his question echoed in his system. Then he came to a realization that he just had a bad day, and he said to himself, "When I wake up tomorrow, everything will be normal." He decided to close his eyes and try to drift back to sleep, and he lay there for a while. Then Bucky heard Dave Williamson's voice. Dave was singing, "What time is it? 4:30. Dave kept singing as he entered Bucky's dorm house and made his way to his door and knocked. Bucky invited him in and told him about the dream and about his notion that everything would be fine tomorrow. And Dave told Bucky he was tripping. Dave offered him some Boone Farm wine, and they laughed about Anthony Robbins being in Bucky's dream, and they drank. Dave said to find him if Bucky needed him, and he left. Now, in his manifesto, the longer line, I read that at age 14, Bucky had met Anthony Robbins. Robbins introduced him to neuro-linguistic programming and the power of thought pattern mimicking. Robbins cited As a Man Thinketh, a book written by a devout Christian who believed that if we aligned our thoughts with God, we could do whatever we believed we could do. Similarly, if you believed you could not do something, that thought alone was an unbreakable barrier. The book states, whether you believe you can or you can't, you're right. And I hold this to be true. We create what we focus on. If you focus on the difficulty of getting rich, you will probably be frustrated and thwarted in the attainment of wealth.
Attitude affects outcome has been proven to be true, but simply focusing on something can't create something out of nothing.
It's not nothing. Your focus is something. In the 1950s, the government was focusing on communists. My grandfather was fired for being a communist. After being fired, he couldn't get a job. Nobody wanted to talk to him. Guess what? He became a communist. The government actually created a large group of communists opposed to their form of government by focusing on this idea. There wasn't a huge, large population of people identifying themselves as communists until after the government focused so much energy on disseminating this idea. But Anthony Robbins went a step further and suggested that by using neuro-linguistic programming, we could get other people to do things, and that you could train humans to have physical reactions to specific words. This is something that psychologists are beginning to embrace more fully.
I know it to be true. I mean, outside of the growing popularity and credibility of hypnosis, my mum would say to me sometimes, "Sleep, my angel," and I'd fall asleep.
Really? That is very trusting of you to share.
Well, thank you. I mean, if I didn't fall asleep, I would at least feel drowsy. It works to this day. If I'm having trouble falling asleep, my wife will say to me, "Sleep, my angel," and I'll get drowsy, and she may repeat it, and at any rate, I'll eventually fall asleep.
Your wife does what your mom created as a trained response.
I'd never thought about it like that. This isn't about me. Please continue.
Right. Back to the story. Bucky went back to sleep for a while, and when he woke next, it was 4:20 a.m. He had just had a dream about his old roommate, Mark Maiman, and a good friend, David Gleiberman, coming to see him. Bobby had a field day with this. Yeah, right, Mark and David are coming. They're in L.A. Bobby went on for a while about how he was being ridiculous, chiding Bucky hard, and saying that if they showed up, he had won. Then Bobby went silent, and Bucky sat there feeling awkward. Out loud, he cursed himself for thinking this way. I mean, he was sitting there, not feeling tired, not feeling good. He felt like his mental equilibrium had been snapped, and he was sitting up straight but not knowing which way was up. Then the phone rang at 4:23. It was 1:23 in Los Angeles. It couldn't be Mark and David, and yet he thought it was. He answered the phone, and it was Mark and David. And Bobby said, "You win." For the next 3 days, Bucky didn't sleep.
How do you know this?
I was there, and he wrote about it. Bucky was excited and scared, and he didn't sleep because of that combination. He was excited at having tapped into a new energy, but he was scared because he feared those who had mastered this energy may try to recruit him as their subordinate or banish him from the game. So he walked around chanting, "Those who are bound by desire will only see the outward container." This was a central theme of a spoken word show he was producing discussing two frames of mind, Attica and Nasarima. Now, don't bother looking these words up. Bucky invented them. They're similar to the left brain, right brain distinctions. And he defined Attica as the frame of mind where he was playing in symbols, and Nasarima was the frame of mind where he was playing with aesthetics and the senses. Another way of looking at it would be closed and open systems. Attica could grapple with finite systems, while Nasarima danced with cosmic order. The show, which eventually toured to Martha's Vineyard, was entitled Magic, Modern Persuasion in Advertising and Politics. And the show opened with drumming and a single light illuminating a 2D statue of a box. The shadow on his scrim looked like how one might draw a simple cube. 4 drummers filled the stage behind him, led by Muhammad, who's the eldest son of a king in Africa. Muhammad was raised with a father who played a talking drum, where 2 people can have complete conversations with drums, a language sophisticated enough to discuss philosophy. Now, Bennington School officials thought that the pressure of doing the show helped push him over the edge. Now, I agree that there was a connection, but pressure in the traditional sense wasn't a motivator. I mean, he'd been working very hard on magic, modern persuasion, and advertising and politics during the week before he lost his shit.
Did Richard think of himself as a magician?
Just in terms of being a performer. He loved how Phil Goldstein would present himself as a real magician.
What do you mean?
Well, Richard presented himself with the confidence of a magician. An air of invincibility that is only achieved by knowing you know something that others don't, and this gives you calm prowess. He would sometimes recite lines from movies that helped him capture that energy.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. I heard him say it enough that I practically have it memorized. It's from Pulp Fiction. It's Ezekiel chapter 25, verse 17. The path of the righteous man is beset on all sides by the iniquities of the selfish and the tyranny of evil men. Blessed is he who in the name of charity and goodwill shepherds the weak through the valley of darkness, for he is truly his brother's keeper and the finder of lost children. Ring a bell? Remember? It's when Samuel Jackson and John Travolta are about to shoot the shit out of some incompetent wannabe gangster. The quote goes on about striking down with great vengeance those who harm his brothers.
Yeah, I know exactly the scene you're talking about. I was distracted that the combination to the briefcase was 666.
Well, Richard's air of magician was very different than Phil Goldstein, who presented himself as having supernatural powers. Phil didn't act as Max Maven, mentalist, capable of reading minds. When he called himself Max Maven, he presented his magic tricks as reality. When he was Phil Goldstein, he wrote articles on the tricks of prestigitators. When Richard Wilson did his stage shows, he was a different person.
What were his stage shows like?
Well, the premise of his show is that by unconsciously accepting mass communications, we are adopting alien thought patterns. These thought patterns are viruses, engineered to run specific programs. They have an agenda to trigger a buzz-whir effect in our brains when presented with certain situations. At best, these Manchurian triggers feel like self-expression, and at worst, they feel bothersome.
So how did Bucky relate to being a magician when he was off stage?
In real life, Richard would sometimes frame himself as a magician.
So what would Richard do to present himself as a magician?
Well, once when I was in Hawaii, and I was about to get on the plane to go home, he gave me one of those cardboard box Dole carry-ons with 2 pineapples in it. He told me that no matter what, I wasn't to open the pineapples until I got back to my house. And I thought, yeah, right. I was planning on breaking out a machete on the plane and creaking these bad boys open. This was way before 9/11. Anyway, I got home and didn't think anything about them. I just had 2 pineapples. My girlfriend Beth came over, and the next morning she was excited to have Hawaiian pineapple, so I cut the crown off the top of one in preparation to serve it up. And there was a hole inside the pineapple, like it had a cavity in it.
Cavity, like it was rotten out?
No, a cavity like a compartment or non-filled space, a cache. I cut down the side, and inside the pineapple was a QP of Hawaiian kind.
QP? Hawaiian kind of what?
Chronic. 1/4 pound of pot, really good marijuana. They call it kind because it's very kind to you. You know, like somebody saying, that's really kind. Beth wanted to open the other pineapple, but I wanted to wait. I couldn't figure out how Bucky got the pot in the pineapple. I couldn't see any incisions or anything. So I figured that if I let the other pineapple rot, I could see where the incision was, but nothing emerged. It just rotted, and eventually the bag of pot oozed through the decomposing skin of the pineapple. I couldn't see any glue or grafting or anything. I have no idea how he got the pot in the pineapple. It's probably 5 months before I saw him again, and I asked him, Bucky, how did you get the pot in the pineapples? But he just shook his head, and in a faux disappointed voice said, Howard, I never ask you how you do your tricks.
That's a great story.
Yeah, I didn't think you'd like it because of the pot.
Howard, I was in college during the 60s. Did Richard have any developmental problems that you know of?
He was diagnosed as being dyslexic when he was in elementary school, but he claimed he wasn't dyslexic. However, Bucky did fall from a treehouse and landed on his head when he was 5. That had a substantive impact on his development.
But, you know, a concussion doesn't usually have a long-term effect.
Well, it does if he had proper nomonomia, in terms of overcompensating for not remembering names.
Where did you learn about that? Proper nomonomia was written up in journals of abnormal psychology until the late 80s. He couldn't have been diagnosed with PNA when he was 5. One can't even detect the symptoms in young kids.
I read about it in 7 Sins of Memory. I read a lot. Anyway, just because something doesn't have a proper label doesn't mean it doesn't have a substantive impact. Gravity still held us in when we thought towards Earth was uniformly down and we didn't have the word gravity. We humans think we are so smart, and yet it took us until the late 90s to figure out how to put wheels in a suitcase and invent a working roller bag. I'm sorry, I got distracted from Bucky's trip at Bennington and what led him to the hospital in Vermont. Remember where I left off. Mark and David were calling, and Bucky asked Mark and David why they called, and they told him they had just gotten back from a concert and had called each other and were thinking of him, so they figured they would give him a call. Then Bucky asked David if he was a magician. David said yes, but he was joking. David was stoned and just rolling with the flow of the conversation. It didn't matter. Twisp. Bucky took David's confirmation that he was a magician as a revelation, so he knew his initiation had begun. Hanging up the phone, he went back to his room to throw his die. Now, Bucky's description of the series of events is rather incomprehensible. He would say a thought while rolling the die, and the die would tell him the structure of the thought. Now, listen carefully. A 1 referred to a thought that was either a part of a bigger idea or a unifying principle. A 2 represented a duplicity, like calling a circle on the 8-ball 1 circle. A 3 was a base to an idea, like how a triangle is the base to a tetrahedron. A triangle cannot exist in nature. It is a surface of a bigger structure. 2-dimensional shapes only exist in our minds, not nature. A 4 was a solid structure of a thought. A 5 was an idea that was prone to influence, either being influenced or influencing others. And 6 was a working system or a restructured thought. Synthetics in motion, intelligent. These meanings from numbers were derived from his numerology. 1 either was one element of something else, or was the grand idea that there is only one, all, infinity. 2 was either the idea of one idea rotating around another, or 2 ideas circulating around each other in a celestial dance. Now, I brought with me what he actually noted in his journal.
Is that the original?
No, it's a Xerox. There's no way I could remember this sequence. I brought it because I thought it might help.
I'm glad you brought it.
Okay. Reportedly, Bucky rolled a die as he spoke. He explained in the previous page that he internalized the answer as he said the statement out loud, which is weird because he actually notates the answer for each roll. Now, he said aloud, "This is weird." Then he rolled the die, which landed on 5. 5, a thought prone to persuasion. Then he said, "I am weird," and rolled a 5 again. 5, a thought prone to persuasion. "I have power." 3, a solid thought. "There is power." 4, a complete thought. "I have power." 3, a solid thought. "I am the power." 5, a thought prone to persuasion. "I am him." 5, a thought prone to persuasion. "This is it." 1, an ambiguous answer, either a duplicitous thought with 2 disguised as a 1 or 1, 1. "This is it." 6, a restructured thought. "It is it." 4, a complete thought. "I am it." 2, a duplicitous thought. "This is normal." 3, a solid thought. "This is it." 1, an ambiguous answer, either duplicitous thought with 2 disguised as a 1 or 1, 1. Should I keep going?
Well, how much longer is it?
It's another page.
Yeah, keep going. Maybe I'll hear a rhythm.
All right. Please stop notating the meaning of each number. "Who are you?" 6, the devil. 5, God. 5, I am God. 3, you are God. 2, you are it. 2, you are all. 4, there is only one, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, yes. 5, 1, 1, 1, 5, 1, 1. There's only 1, 1, 4. That's it. That's all he included.
That was pretty exhaustive. I'm going to need to review all of this. Can I keep these sheets?
Sure.
Okay, so what happened next? What's that?
My cell phone. Excuse me. This is... Hello. Hey. Yes. Uh-huh, yep. Okay, uh-huh. What? Why would he say that? No, he isn't getting it. We can't be superlative and specific on a national basis. We're 11 individual wireless companies joined into one. We don't have a national attribute to hang our hat on. Fits you best is superlative and ambiguous enough to allow for our regional advantages. Yes. Okay, tell him I'll be there in the afternoon. This is important to me. I scheduled these as vacation days. This isn't the type of thing I can reschedule. When I get on the plane this afternoon, I won't get into Hartford until after 2 tomorrow. I lose almost a full day flying from Hawaii. No, it's afternoon here now. Can I call you on your cell in half an hour? Okay, good. I'm sorry to rush you. Yeah, I'm still in a meeting. Yeah. Okay, I'll call you soon. Sorry, where were we?
That's okay. So, what did Richard write what happened next?
Bucky headed to VAPA, which is Bennington's Visual and Performing Arts Center. Vapac sounded funny, so they left off the C. He found one kid working up there, an Asian kid he'd talked to before, but Bucky wasn't sure of the name because he wrote Wayne followed by a question mark. He watched him for a while, and he nodded in approval of Bucky's company and painted undisturbed. After a while, he turned to him and asked, "Bucky, do you believe there is one right way to do something?" Hell, even in retrospect, it's freaky how much what happened over this time shared a synchronicity. At the time, Bucky projected this theme as relating to a Sufi moral value system, and this question felt like part of an initiation, a Socratic conversation to lead him to their ways. Now, Bucky said that he thought at times that there were multiple right ways. Wayne said yes, but for each one from one perspective it was the right way, and Bucky agreed. Then Wayne talked about how Dave Williamson eats a cheeseburger. The whole process is in preparation for the last bite. Williamson eats around the edge. He designs it so that the last bite has a bit of everything, some tomato, some lettuce, cheese, burger, and the right combination of sauce. This way, the last bite, the experience that lingers in your mind, is a great bite of cheeseburger. And Williamson and Bucky talked about the merits of rolling toothpaste tubes and paint tubes from the bottom. They talked about avoiding taking unnecessary physical risks without being restrained by the idea of physical harm. They talked about the value of altered states of consciousness and wound up on the idea that there was no such thing as an altered state of consciousness, since neither believed in an empirically normal state of consciousness. Well, and Bucky got up to go, and another student named Craig wandered in and asked Bucky where he was going. He said outside. Craig asked him what he was doing up, and Bucky told him he couldn't sleep. And Craig said that not sleeping was dangerous, and then Craig sped off. Once outside, Bucky saw the likeness of blue that indicates dawn is not far off. You know, Buckminster Fuller hated the word sunrise. He suggested that it disorients people. Intellectually, we are taught that the Earth rotates, which controls the visibility and non-visibility of the sun. And the term sunrise suggests that we are still and the sun is rising. Fuller thought that terms like this should be replaced by something that better resembles our phenomenological experience, and he suggested sunsight for sunrise and sunclipse for sunset. Fuller argued that for 500 years we have known that the Earth is revolving on its own axis, but our vocabulary hasn't caught up with our knowledge. Bucky dwelt on Fuller's ideas. I know this because his journal has an essay at this point looking at synergy from a psychological perspective. I had the previous stuff about Fuller and sunsight. Bucky's journal only has the previous encounter with Wayne and Craig, and then says, "When I left VAPA, it was a beautiful sunsight. The oranges were intense. Afterwards, I headed to the cafeteria for breakfast. then the word synergy. Fuller coined the word synergy and sunsight. I figured it was appropriate to go off on what I speculate Bucky may have been thinking about. Bucky's later notes also had additions to the concept of four. He held that four could be complete thought, or it could be duplicitous, representing a square, the ultimate synthesizing of unnaturalness presented as natural. Is this okay?
I think it's great. I appreciate your perspective. You're doing good. It's really helpful for me to understand this much about Richard Wilson. Now, I'd like to spend some time with his journal.
I'm getting tired.
Maybe we should take a break. It would help if you brought back his journals in and let me read them for myself. At any rate, I have to get to the children's school, an elementary school here in Kanohu. I volunteer here about one afternoon a week.
Donating my time makes me appreciative that I'm in a position to give. Donating my time allows me to count my blessings.
Yeah, me too. I'm not always sure what to focus my positional advantages on.
Me either.
I was introduced to the school because my nephew goes to the children's school. I didn't like the way they were handling the children with special needs. They were trying behavioral counseling, but they just didn't have the resources. My nephew was falling behind in his grade, along with a number of other children. When appropriate, I prescribed medications that helped them in class and in school.
How have you helped them?
I've diagnosed many children, and the behavioral problems have diminished.
How do you treat them?
Well, many remain in counseling, but many, like my nephew, are fine with just meds so long as they stay on them. This frees up the counselors to work with the kids that really need the counseling. Kids that come from hostile homes and need immediately, sort of coping skills. But we get off track. I was asking about Bucky's journals.
I can't let you have his journals. Bucky told me not to. I can share what I have read verbally, but I am not to release his original materials to anybody.
Yes, but surely this is an extenuating circumstance.
I'm telling you everything I can. I cannot give the journals to you. I gave my word.
Fair enough.
We'll meet again in 3 weeks then.
Yes, February the 23rd.
Until then.
Yes, until then, thank you once again.
You're welcome.
Julian, if you'd hit the recording off.